Hello, friends. How is everybody today? Hopefully, you guys can all hear the music, and hopefully, the sound is alright. If it's too loud or too quiet, let me know. It is meant to be background music while I'll be reading. So, it's meant to be heard, but hopefully not overpower me. So, as you can see, the winner was The Written by Ben Galley, the Harry Potter meets Sin City one. Alright, so this is book 1 of the Emaneska series, The Written by Ben Galley. And once again, do please tell me if the music is louder than it ought to be. You should be able to hear it, but it should not be overpowering my speech. Part 1. It begins with snow. Chapter 1. When the sons of gods went to the daughters of man and had children by their wombs, they became the giants of old, the Nephilim, men of renown and infamy, dangerous like wolves among sheep. From the Gathered Prophetics. It was snowing outside. The white flakes drifted lazily in the chill night breeze, dusting the rocky mountainside with an ivory blanket. Ice crystals flurried and spun, dancing through the cold air, skittering along the windowsill. By all rights, it was a foul night for Arfel. The tall spire rose like a forgotten nail from an outcrop of quiet buildings huddled together between the snowy caps. A lonely window glowed brightly through the whiteout. Framed in the yellow light was a silhouette of a very old man, standing at the windowsill with his arms crossed. He fought back yet another yawn, staring at the snowflake lingering on his fingertip. He shivered but stayed put, pressing his warm palms to the frigid stone. After a long day of hard study, the weather was calming, cooling, and it had been a hard day indeed. Behind him, gathered around a desk awash with papers and maps, sat a group of 4 aged men, each of them still poring over the small black book. It sat in its own circle of polished wood, isolated from the papery chaos surrounding it, alone and aloof. Hello, boss. The room around them was cavernous, packed floor to ceiling with bursting bookshelves, each one filled with an impossible amount of paper and knowledge. Loose papers poked out from every crevice. Scrolls lay under chairs and side tables. Old maps and notes littered the floors and shelves like dried autumn leaves. One single candle, almost at the end of its wick, clung to life on the corner of the wooden desk, throwing yellow light and distorted shadows against the walls whenever the breeze toyed with it. "What makes us so sure it is Siren?" asked the man at the window. He absently twisted a strand of his long white hair around a wrinkled finger as he reached for a nearby cup of warm wine. The papery waddle of skin around his neck made his chin non-existent. "Of course it is, Gurn. Just look at the scales of the front cover," replied one of the others avidly. He waved his hand in a somewhat dismissive gesture. He coughed hoarsely, as if the cough had caught him by surprise, and then dabbed a handkerchief to his lips. Spectacles made from thin slices of rare crystal balanced precariously on his nose and long beard. Streaked with gray, cascaded down his neck and chest. Dragon, no doubt about it. And one doesn't simply go around borrowing their scales for book covers. The group of scholars mused for a few moments. "Where was it found again?" asked another, peering at his colleagues from under wiry gray eyebrows. The bespectacled man spoke up again. "No one knows exactly. Some village in southern Nelska," he said, and there was silence. 15 years later, and only now do we get to study this manuscript. "Who knows the incalculable value of the magic held inside this book?" said Inel, tugging his long blue robe about him. It was now too cold. He shivered as he pulled the stained glass windows shut with a bang. He turned inside, leaning back against the stone sill and looking to the man with the tiny glasses. "The only real question is this. How do we get the confounded thing open? Have we had a reply from Krausling yet, Inel?" The scholar with the wiry eyebrows answered. No, not as yet. They're always late. He trailed off, distracted. He leant forwards to take a closer look at the book lying on the desk. It was small, no wider or taller than the span of a man's hand. Black dragon scales adorned the cover, overlapped and pressed flat, then trimmed to fit its square shape. Probably from an infant worm, thought Gurn, as he let his fingers trace the ridges and dips of its cover. A thick gold lock, simple but sturdy, wrapped around the book's waist, sealing it tight. There wasn't a keyhole or opening mechanism in sight. The ancient pages poking out from the edges were scored and dirty. Gurn tried once again to split a few pages apart with the long yellow fingernail, but the book was locked fast, and not even the tip of a knife blade could squeeze between them. After a rather dramatic sigh, he entwined his fingers and leant back in his chair. The ornate wood creaked as he did so. Well, nothing's changed since this afternoon. A bloody thing's still locked. And as none of us here possess the skill to unlock it, or could even guess what spell might force it open, I suggest we just wait for... Gurn was interrupted by the sounds of heavy boots on stone. A loud voice made them all turn. Having trouble, wise men of Arfel? A tall figure stood in the doorway, hooded, with hands clasped behind his back. The newcomer walked from the door to the desk in just a few long strides and stomped the last bit of snow from his black leather boots. The scholars were startled, to say the least, but as the man moved from the shadows and into the candlelight, they recognized a familiar face. The man threw back his hood, and a chorus of respectful smiles followed, even a few groaning, creaking attempts at bowing. Inel jumped up to greet the man with a warm handshake, the wattle of skin beneath his neck wobbling like a turkey's. "Your mage! What an unexpected honor! With the weather and all, we didn't expect you or Audrin to arrive for another 2 days," he rattled. The tall mage kept his smile as he removed his hooded green-gold robe and folded it neatly over an armchair. There was a long sword at his waist, sheathed in an ornate scabbard, and his expensive tunic was made of a fine emerald cloth trimmed with white and gold. "Do not be ridiculous, scholar. The weather has never stopped me," he chuckled. "When we heard that you had uncovered a long-lost book of secrets, I decided that no time should be wasted in coming to examine it." The man crossed his muscular arms and looked at each of them with hard hazel eyes. "Please, show me what you have found." Inel retreated slowly to a chair. Gurn rose, obviously eager to impress, while the others remained silent and seated, fingers entwined in their long, flowing beards. "It is most definitely Siren, your mage, as we thought, but this book is not from the time of the war. It seems to be very different from the other texts we recovered from the dragon riders. Much older, perhaps." "Continue," said the man. Gurn pointed to the gold on the black cover. "It has a lock on the cover, and no key or keyhole with which to unlock it. Magical, clearly. We've come across the type of thing before, but this is too powerful and too ancient for our minds, or for the library mages. And so, as of yet, we have been unable to read it." Gurn shrugged, gazing wistfully at the little book. "Hence our humble request." There was a moment of silence while a smile crept over the visitor's wind-burned face. Unusual for him. "Perhaps I should take a look." His hazel eyes flicked around the circle. "If I can get it open, can you translate it?" One of the other scholars answered. "If it is legible, your mage, then we can read it. The scholars of Arfil have tackled almost all of the languages that Emaneska has ever spoken or written down. There's hardly a book we have come across that we couldn't translate." He spoke his words with a slow and constant nodding of his head. He was the oldest by many a mile, grayer than a winter's day and waiting patiently at death's doorstep. The others murmured their assent with a symphony of throat clearing and the scratching of chins and facial hair. "Good." The mage strode forwards and flexed his hands. He leant over the oak desk, humming and musing and making a sucking noise with his teeth. The scholars watched him think, looking between themselves at the mixture of intrigue and uncertainty. The tall man muttered something as he reached towards the book, his fingers rigid and outspread. A ripple of air pulsated from his hand like a wave of heat over a fire. A purple spark danced over the cover. "This book is strong," he muttered between pursed lips. He seemed to be straining to keep his fingers spread now. The mage's hand pulsed again, and he took a firmer stance, spreading his feet and gripping the edge of the table. More sparks fizzed over the cover, and then, quite abruptly, something inside the gold band clicked and smoothly rolled open. The scholars leant forwards with open mouths, rheumy eyes wide in their eagerness to see what the dark book held between its dusty yellow pages. The tall mage wiped a drop of sweat from his brow and smiled, clenched his fist several times, as if the magic had stung him. "Read your book, gentlemen," he said. The oldest scholar wiped something from his nose and carefully lifted the scaly cover. With agonizing slowness, he bared its papers to the light and tested the crinkles with his fingers. He peered at the script. "It's Elvish. Dark Elf, if I'm not mistaken. A very strange dialect. I haven't seen a text like this for years," he said shakily. "Elvish. An old language indeed," said the mage. It may have been the flickering candlelight, but it seemed to Gurn that his eyes widened at the news. "One of the oldest, your mage," he answered. The old scholar shuddered as he read onwards. He coughed as he turned page. "It reads, 'The Testament of Bringing?' But that word could also mean creating or summoning." Gurn adjusted his crystal spectacles and peered at the writing. The mage turned to him, looking down his nose at the scholar. "Summoning?" Gurn nodded eagerly, almost losing his glasses. "Yes, the dark elves were capable of raising all manner of creatures from their wells of magic, as I'm sure you're aware." The old scholar tapped the page. "It is a manual of some kind, your mage. Here, warnings to acolytes." "Hi, Lucas." Inel took up the lecture. The subject of elves was a passion of his. They could summon huge beasts from the darkest places of the world at the cast of a single spell. Inel went to a bookshelf and brought back a rare slice of tapestry covered with crude pictures. They depicted battles with strange goblin-type animals and giant winged creatures with many horns, wearing what looked to be golden crowns. "I remember," muttered the mage as he turned the tapestry to face him. The others looked up questioningly. "I said I remember seeing something like this before, in other books and old paintings in Krauslang." "Of course, your mage," Gurn nodded, wondering if he had seen any such paintings in the Art Cathedral. There was an itch in his mind. "If it's a spell manual, where are its keys?" the mage asked, leaning over the book once more, casting it in shadow. "Hi, Lennox." Gurn and the others all peered at the faded flowing script. Keys could be found in every spell book, and any book without them was useless. They were the start of any incantation, the unlocking words to begin a spell. "No, Lucas, I'm postponing the song due to vocal difficulties." The oldest scholar turned a few pages carefully, where more runes were scribbled. "For this spell? Well, this is a very old spell indeed, very powerful." He pointed to a few symbols hiding at the corners of one page. There and the other there. Those are the main words, me and here. Saying them in the other order, of course, would open the spell. I don't dare to read aloud in its language." His voice cracked and his words trailed off into silence. The scholar's hand was shaking more than usual. "It seems we have uncovered a very special book indeed. It must be over 1,000 years old, maybe more." Inel pointed. "This needs careful translation. Look, it seems to reference something called 'Thy Darkness Swallowed,' or 'Mouths of Darkness.' Yes, that's it. Over and over again on these 2 pages." "And you are sure this book is not another fake?" The man had a hungry look in his eye, looking at the scholars like a wolf standing over a huddle of gray-haired rabbits. His arms were crossed, but his voice was now low and dangerous. Inel nodded eagerly. "Oh, it's very real, your mage. An elven summoning manual, if you ask me." It's dangerous, whatever it is, said Gurn. That itch had become bothersome, as if he'd left a candle burning somewhere. The man flashed teeth. How interesting this all is. He drummed his fingers on the desk absently. Well, it seems to me you have been most useful to me this evening. I'm sure Audrin will be as pleased as I am to hear of this discovery. The oldest scholar rose shakily from his chair and bowed his head. Thank you, your mage. We will continue to study this manual with diligence. There is much more knowledge to be gained from it, and without you, sir, we would probably still have a locked book. He smiled, and the other scholars managed a polite laugh. The air had become stale and thick. The mage laughed heartily, startling them as the noise broke the hushed atmosphere. And without you, old fools, I would have nothing. The smile was replaced by thin lips. In a silver blur, the mage drew his sword and slammed the blade into Gurn's chest. He fell from the blade with a gurgling scream. The mage swung right, cutting the throat of the old scholar. Dark blood painted the books and pages scattered across the desk. Sparks of electricity danced around the man's free hand. With a snarl and a flick of his wrist, a bolt of lightning surged into the others, burning the clothes from their backs and their skin to charcoal. An acrid smoke filled the room. His business concluded, the man calmly sheathed the sword and lifted the black book from the desk. Wiping the blood from its cover, he turned on his heel, picked up his robe from the chair, and left without another sound. Gurn choked, spitting blood on the floor. He attempted to crawl, but found his strength ebbing away with every withering beat of his heart. He died with his arm stretched out to the door. Hundreds of miles away, in the west, a yellow dawn was breaking over an empty, snow-covered countryside. The cold morning light shone through skeletal trees, scattered patterns across winter snowdrifts. The wilderness was undulating, with rolling hills and patches of scrawny wood springing up between boulders, frozen streams, and endless snow. Apart from the drip of melting ice and the rattle of wind in the bone-like branches, not a sound could be heard. A broken castle rose from a tall mound, crowned by concentric rings of ruined walls and dilapidated stone rampants. A round tower squatted in disrepair at the center of the castle, still sporting an empty flagpole. The massive stones of the walls were covered in brown moss and hanging icicles. The crenellations adorned with cuts and gashes forged by the war engines of old. The pale morning was disturbed by the faint noise of a heavy-breathing newcomer. The hooded figure came from the south, trudging through the deep snow towards the castle, his long brown cloak billowing behind him in the icy breeze. Hot breath escaped in smoky plumes from his mouth, and the sound of his laboring was loud against the silence. The man paused to pull his cloak about him and catch his breath. In the half-light of the early morning, his keen eyes picked out an arched doorway set deep into the thick outer wall. "Carmbrig," he muttered, lowering his red scarf from his face. After spitting in the snow, he checked the woods to his left and right with a wary glance, and then trudged on through the deep snow. Beneath a black cloak, the man wore light steel plate armor over his shoulders, chest, and thighs, which clanked noisily as he moved. Around his waist was a thick leather belt holding onto his supplies, and an old sword encased in a dark red scabbard. Something gold and scarlet and metal peeked out from beneath the sleeves of his thick cloak. The man's sturdy black boots wearily plunged into the pure white snow, making creaking noises with every step. The stranger reached the small stone archway and spread his hands over the thick oak door, feeling the splintered wood and thick spikes that held the gate together. The man gave it a light push, but nothing budged. It was locked tight from the inside. He shoved a shoulder against it in a futile attempt to move the ancient wood, but still nothing. He looked at the door quizzically. The planks were weathered from hundreds of years of wind and snow, yet for some reason they had not rotted away like the other wooden features of the ancient castle. The hooded man stretched his back and neck before rolling up his sleeves. Adorning his wrists and lower forearms were thick vambraces made of interwoven red and gold metal scales. They glittered faintly in the dawn light and clanked as he held them together. He closed his eyes as he placed his palms flat on the door. A pulse rippled across the wood, and there came a dull clang from the other side. He gave it another push, and the door swung open with a creak. He allowed himself a faint smile as he peered into the gloom. He wrinkled his nose. It smelled like 1,000 years of damp, blood, and little glory. The faint sound of dripping on stonework echoed from somewhere in the darkness. Mold hid between the cracks in the walls. Without a sound, the man ducked under the thick stone archway and stood in the dim corridor, listening. He made a fist. White light shivered around his fingers, bathing the corridor in a pale moonlight glow. Surrounded by his light, the stranger began to investigate the old castle, poking around in holes and long-lost underground chambers. Cavernous halls and old rooms spread out like a warren as he went deeper and deeper into the castle. Everything was rotting and damp. Old curtains decayed where they had been ripped down. Chests and furniture had been smashed against walls and lay in dark heaps and broken postures. In old abandoned barracks, benches and tables were pushed up against splintered doors. Rusty swords hid under the rubble. There were no bones, no clothes. The rats had taken everything long ago. For hours, the man searched the dank castle and found nothing except darkness and ruin. "Hi, Joe." In a tiny room deep underground, he carefully took a seat on one of the less broken chairs and rested his feet for a moment. He was beginning to tire from keeping up his light spell, but he was sure there was something inside there had to be something inside the old castle. His orders had stipulated he be thorough, and Carnbreg was not a small castle by any means. Absently, the man picked up a small piece of rubble and toyed with it for a few moments before tossing it across the room in boredom. To his surprise, the stone sailed straight through a frayed tapestry, landing with a clang somewhere far behind it. He clenched his fist again, and a fresh wave of light penetrated the gloom. He ripped the tapestry from its rusted hangings and threw it on the dusty floor. Hidden behind it was a staircase that spiraled down into the dark shadows. Curiosity sparked, he jogged down the steps, his footsteps echoing against the narrow walls. After barely 2 turns around the pillar, the stairs came to a halt and a long hallway snaked out around a corner. Sconces holding long torches poked out from recesses in the walls. The man moved to the nearest one and felt the oil-soaked wick between his finger and thumb. It was dry enough. The man clicked his fingers over the torch and sparks flew, sending flame curling up the wall. Dousing his light spell, he continued down the corridor, lighting each torch as he went. It was not long before he came across a huge door set deep in the stonework, held by thick hinges and a massive bolt that was fused to the metal bracing it. Eyes closed, the man ran his hand over the wood, searching for the right spell to use. But when he threw a wave of magic at the door, it didn't even move an inch. "Hi, Bowtie." Irritated, he tried again. The air hummed as he hit the wood with another spell. Nothing happened. He thumbed his stubbled chin and thought for a moment. It was then that a deep boom rang out somewhere below his feet. It made the torches shiver in their sconces. The man drew his sword from its scabbard as a few specks of dust fell from the ceiling. He squinted at the torches. The flames were shifting, leaning far out from the wall as if blown by a stiff breeze. He listened, watched, ready for anything. Nothing came, and all was silent again in the old castle. Bored, the stranger sheathed his sword with the metallic ring. He climbed the stairs, turning left, then right, then left again, up more stairs, retracing his steps. Soon he was out in the snow once more, with the bright morning sun stinging his dusty eyes. He slammed the door behind him and stepped out into the white glare. "What a pointless trip that was," he spat, bending to pick up a handful of snow to rub between his fingers and wipe off the castle's muck. As he reached for another handful, a shadow passed over him without a sound, a large, fast-moving shape that his eyes had to chase. The man sighed as he straightened, throwing off his cloak and drawing his sword with a flourish. "Thank you for the lurk, Bowtie." Spinning the blade in his hand, he calmly surveyed the peaceful countryside. His steel glinted in the sunlight. "It's not even noon yet, and a man has to deal with worms," he muttered to himself as his eyes roved. A screeching roar came from the skies above. The man leapt sideways, narrowly escaping the massive claws that plummeted into the snow behind him with a huge crash and a shower of snow. The man got to his feet and disdainfully brushed the white powder from his armor. He looked up as a snarl came from the white haze. The worm reared its ugly blue head, shaking its horns with a rattle and spreading its stunted turquoise wings. A ridge of sharp brown spikes ran from its head to the tip of its serpentine tail. The monster's claws pawed at the snow, razor-sharp and curved like a cat's. Its eyes were like black pools of jet. It was old for a wild dragon, and the ones that survive the longest are nothing if not notoriously hungry. The worm let out a deafening horn-like scream and took a step. It had been a while since the man had seen such a large worm. It towered above him. He felt the wafting of its stink, old meat and something musky and reptilian. The man began to circle the creature, holding his sword out straight towards it. "Leave now, or this will end badly for you," he ordered, in a measured tone, still treading sideways through the deep snow. The worm snarled, obviously lacking the capacity to understand him, and stamped its enormous feet like an impatient bull. It screeched again, and foul spit flew into the man's face. He grimaced and wiped the phlegm from his cheek and forehead, careful to keep his eyes on the snarling beast. "I will take that as a no." The beast charged with frightening speed, but the man was more than ready. Dropping swiftly to one knee, he dug his blade into the snow with a thud. A solid wall of magic tore through the snow like a rippling earthquake, knocking the reptile to the snow with a disappointed whine. The man was on it in a flash, dragging his sword across the beast's belly. The blade cut a bloody path across its scales, splashing the snow blue. The beast's whip-like tail lashed out and struck the man hard in the chest. He somersaulted into a nearby snowdrift with a crunch of armor. A star or two swam before his eyes. Before he had time to take a breath, the hungry worm charged at him again. It scratched and it spat, and the man waved his sword wildly to keep the claws at bay. A straight talon scraped across his armor and found soft, pale skin underneath. With a cry, he rolled sideways to the snow and managed to escape. Red blood stained the dirty snow beneath him, mixing with the blue. Getting swiftly to his feet, the man smacked his vambraces together, and a blast of flame shook the cold air. The fireball hit the worm in the chest and sent the creature reeling backwards. It roared with pain, frantically thrashing its tail in an effort to fend off the man, but it was futile. He sprinted forwards. A light pulsed down his forearm, and his blue-stained sword wreathed in flame. With a grunt, he hurled the glowing blade with both hands, and like a fiery arrow, it buried itself hilt deep in the dragon's ribcage. The beast uttered a last mournful whistle and toppled over against a nearby tree in a shower of broken branches. Breathing heavily and wiping snow from his face, the man strode forwards to wrench his blade from the worm's smoking ribs. He felt the pain as he pulled it free. He put a hand to his side and winced, feeling the wet blood seeping from the long cut. Retrieving his bloody cloak from beneath the worm's leg, he sighed and began to follow his footprints back south. Pardon me. Chapter 2. The long winter started gradually during the years of our long war with the sirens. The heat was slowly taken from our days, one by one, and the sun from our sky, until our 76th year, the year of our last summer. The snowstorms gathered and the ice fields grew, creeping inexorably south until they almost threatened to cover Nelska. And ever since the end of the war, our weather has remained cold and bitter, and the proud mountains of Osven stay covered by the eternal snow. From writings found in the libraries of Arfel. The hooded stranger traveled without rest for 2 days, heading south through field and forest and river and hill. On the morning of the third day, he crested a muddy knoll and took a moment to catch his breath. Before him in the valley lay a small village called Leith, built on a rocky crag that overlooked a metallic river and muddy fields. He narrowed his eyes at the tiny town. Its inhabitants had always been wary of strangers and feared his kind especially. They were a superstitious lot, concerned only with their farming and their drinking. Mages weren't to their liking. He decided to give the village his usual wide berth and take the winding route back to the Ark Abbey. Thank you, boss. I actually just took a sip, but I'll take another one. Much obliged. He hopped over a few rocks and slid over some shale, then headed west around the town, sticking to the wilder roads and the copses. A few hours later, the man was treading through the thick loam of the Forest of Durn, a shady wood south of Leith that was seldom entered or explored by the townspeople. Rumor had it that a fierce vampire lived somewhere amongst the dark trees, feeding off the blood of any Albion soul that would trespass in his woods. The stranger clearly didn't believe in any such rumor, and paid attention only to the surrounding forest, still deep in the clutches of the long winter. The snow-laden trees were alive with the breath of a light wind. Bark creaked over the low mown. A few brave animals scuttled around in the frozen loam. Somewhere, a bird cried out. The man kept walking, following the almost indistinguishable trail through the undergrowth. At last he made it to his destination, taking a small winding trail between a wall of bushes and pine trees. Brown needles crunched underfoot as he picked his way under branches and around rocks. Soon he spotted the light of a hidden clearing ahead, and he walked towards it. The trees gave way, revealing a small glade in a tall brick building that had been completely concealed by the forest. This was an Ark Abbey, one of many that had been quietly built across the lands of Albion and Emaneska. Yeah, I'm probably going to have to do that, but you're right, boss. Smoke rose from the windows of the kitchen, and the noise of axes biting wood and other work echoed over the grounds. The tall bell tower rose high above the trees, with glass windows and balconies punctuating its thick granite walls. The bell had been silent for decades, and the man couldn't remember the last time he had heard its doleful pealing. Workers and soldiers were milling around the gardens and taking in the brisk air. The man nodded to a few familiar faces as he walked across the lawn. The cold grass underneath his boots was slippery and was well tended, clipped short and tidy, if not a little brown from the cold. To his left, a few beehives hid among the trees. They seemed lifeless and quiet. An armored soldier standing by the door saluted him with a spear. The man strode inside the arch and felt the warmth of the busy building on his cold skin. He rubbed his hands and shook the mud and ice from his boots, listening to the sounds of cooking and cleaning echoing against the stone walls. With a yawn, the man tackled a dozen flights of stairs and as many corridors until he came to a simple oak door. He pushed it open with a bang. A woman jumped and dropped the bundle of tunics she was carrying and put her hand to her chest in fright. "Oh, Varden, it's you!" She flapped her hand like a fan. "Same old." The man threw his hood back and smiled at the girl. Alessi was his maid and somewhat of a friend to him, having done a bit more than just picking up after him over the years. Her face knew only two expressions, either wearing a cherubic smile or a concerned frown. Her deep brown eyes were always gleaming, as if she had just been handed the juiciest tidbit of gossip. Varden would never have admitted it to her, but Alessi's notorious stubbornness had kept him on track more than once in the last few years. Pardon? Like any good Albion woman, she liked to put a man in his place. Blowing her curly brown hair from her blushing cheeks, the maid started to pick up the dropped clothes. "You could have knocked," she said, flustered. "To my own room? You shouldn't be sneaking around in here." Varden threw her a smile to melt her frown. He threw his cloak on the small bed and sat on the windowsill, watching the trees shiver outside. "Gods know someone needs to look after you mages. Where have you been to this time? Oh, is that blood on your side?" Her face creased up with worry as she rushed to the window to see. Varden glanced down at the roughly bandaged gash that the dragon had gifted him, running along the right side of his ribs. He waved Alessi away as she tried to see the damage. "Don't worry about it. You know it will heal. Alessi, calm down. It's fine." He shooed her away gently and covered it up with a shred of tunic. "What was it this time? Another minotaur? It was a bandit, wasn't it? I knew it." Alessi stood there with her hands on her hips like a scolding mother. Varden looked at her. Alessi, we've known each other a long while, and you've seen me heal from worse wounds before, he said. She just raised her eyebrows at him. He grimaced as he stretched. I'll be fine in a day, he said, then closed his eyes and leant back against the stone to end the matter. It was a wild worm. They hunt magic. Well, no matter what it was, it looks bad to me. At least let me put a poultice on it to bring out any poison, Alessi tutted. You're not indestructible, Farden, and gods know I've told you before, just like his lordship in the tower. 1,000 times, muttered Farden, listening to her earnest rustling. She moved to a nearby jug of water and brought back a wet cloth. The chambermaid dabbed the crusted blood from his ribs as Farden clenched his teeth. Sometimes I think you like throwing yourself into danger all the time, she chided him. Farden didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the leafless trees waving at him outside. Her hands were cold, and so was the water, but it felt good on the burning skin, hot and sweaty from the long trudge south. He felt her hands strayed to his back, and the silence became awkward. The mage spun around and deftly caught her wrist. How many times do I have to tell you? Farden's voice was low, sharp in severity. He stared into her chestnut eyes and slowly let go of her arms. Alessi looked upset. I'm sorry, I just wanted to... But Farden held up a hand. He rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes again. Enough, he said, and the maid backed away. She picked up his cloak and some other clothes and turned to leave. Durnus is waiting for you upstairs, she said. Farden nodded and heard the wooden door click shut. With a sigh, he held the wet cloth to his side. Alessi was a kind soul, but her curiosity was dangerous. It felt harsh keeping her at arm's length, but it had to be done. Her feelings had to be sacrificed for her own safety. There were rules, and even though she was his friend, those rules came first. It was refreshing, though, to be treated with respect, as opposed to the usual uncertainty and fear he received from most of the population of Albion. Farden was usually treated with mild neglect, as more of a dark omen than a blessing, stared at with wary, melancholy eyes like a lone spider passing through. Farden didn't really like people. People were rude, and people were ignorant, oblivious to how the real world worked and moved. They were like ants on a chessboard, and Farden had no time for them. He grunted and scratched at his back and bloodied side. His vambraces felt heavy, and he could feel weariness slowly creeping over him, but with resolve, he made for the door. It was time to see Durnus. A thin old man sat with his back to the door, watching the flames crackle and pop in the fireplace. Drapes hung thick and heavy over the windows, making the huge room dim and full of flickering shadows. Candles dotted the floors and walls, stars in a stone sky, ensconced in holders and perching on tall piles of books. A massive map of Albion hung on the far wall, showing the distant shores of Nelska and the cliff cities of Halorn to the southeast. Farden closed the door behind him, completely silent. His bare feet slowly crept across the cold stone floor towards the old man in his comfy armchair. "You're late," said the old man in a rasping voice. His words made Farden flinch. The travel-weary mage laughed and moved to an empty chair by the fire. "God's sake, Durnus, how do you do that?" Durnus laughed a whispering cackle, grinning widely and baring a pair of sharp fangs. Farden slumped into a comfy armchair and sighed, wincing as his wound scraped against his tunic. "You always forget that I have hearing to rival that of a bat, Farden, whereas you have the footfall of a work cow." Durnus chuckled again and poked at the fire with the long metal rod. "The sun is still up, then, I take it?" Farden nodded and stared into the fire in silence. The old figure in the chair next to him was his closest friend, and one of Emaneska's sharpest historical minds. Farden often found himself wondering how old the vampire truly was. Durnus' eyes were a blue so pale that they almost bordered on white, and his skin was like white paper stretched over a thin frame. His features were sharp and bony. His gray hair swept back and slicked down behind his tall ears, stopping just short of his shoulders. His fangs peeked from behind pale lips when he spoke. "Good," he said. The vampire settled back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Report," he whispered. Varden went to it with the will, recalling every detail of his journey to Combreg, telling Durnus of the strange corridor inside the bowels of the castle and his fight with the wild worm. The vampire merely nodded along, humming at the appropriate points, occasionally clearing his throat, and stroking his sharp chin with a frail hand. When Varden ran out of words, Durnus opened his eyes. "I shall send a full account of the Archcathedral in the morning," he said, "but Combreg can wait for now. Something terrible happened in Arfel." Durnus' face took on a grave quality. Varden looked confused. "The library?" Durnus nodded. "Indeed. I received a hawk from Krauslung this morning relaying some of the darkest news I have heard in a long time." He paused for some sort of dramatic effect. Varden knew the old vampire loved mystery and intrigue, so he waited, playing along. 2 nights ago, somebody broke into the library and murdered 5 of the scholars in cold blood. It was late at night and nobody saw or heard a thing. Several of the scholars were found burnt to a crisp. It seems that a valuable object, an ancient book of some kind, is the only thing that's missing. Durnus drummed his nails on the arm of his chair. Varden let the information sink in. "What was it?" he asked. "No one knows. A message had arrived at the Archcathedral only that day, saying that the scholars in question had found a book in their collection, a siren book, something we stole during the war when we were busy plundering Nelska's coasts. The scholars had only just begun to examine it. They requested that the archmages travel to Arfel to help with the opening of it." Durnus recounted, leaning forwards to warm his hands against the fire. "This book must have been quite something to request the presence of the archmages," mused Varden. "Precisely. And before Adrian or Heliard had a chance to leave, the scholars were murdered and the book was stolen. And let me tell you, from what I gathered from the message, the Archcathedral is in uproar. Heliard is blaming everyone under the sky, especially the sirens, and the good Lord Vice has ordered a regiment of his guards up to the mountains to see if the assassin returns for more books," replied Durnus, his eyes wide with excitement. "Well, what is this book? Why is it so powerful?" "Again, nobody has a clue. The hawk sent from Arfel wasn't exactly full of information. You know what the old men at Arfel are like, full of secrecy and intrigue. All the message stated was that the book was in good condition, locked tight, and of the utmost importance. Apparently it was small, covered in black dragon scales, and protected by a powerful golden seal, with a spell that would require one of the archmages to crack. They assumed it was siren, or perhaps even older, and that it might contain an immense amount of formidable magic. That was it." "Sounds dangerous," Varden said. He got up and revived the dying fire with a few logs and a spark of flame from his hands. Durnus flicked a tongue around one of his sharp fangs and thought. "Indeed," he muttered. Varden knew his friend had a theory, but that he was waiting to be asked, so he relented and smiled. "What are you thinking?" Durnus leapt further out of his chair, making the frame squeak. "One explanation I can muster is that the sirens have a spy in the council. They're the ones we stole it from in the first place. It seems sensible to assume they'd want it back." Varden shrugged as he leant in the fireplace. "A fair idea, but we can't dismiss that it was someone other than the Dragon Riders. It's been 15 years since the war, and the ceasefire has yet to be broken. So why would they risk breaking it to retrieve one little book?" Varden asked. "That depends on the value hidden within its pages, my good mage. Who else? Skullguard has no interest in magic, nor could their sorcerers know of such a book's existence. We Arca did not know of it until a couple of days ago. If this book is as powerful as we might think it be, then the Siren Wizards would most definitely risk a ceasefire to get it back into their scaly hands." Durnus' words made sense, but Varden did not like the sound of them. "In any case, the Archmages have sent word that you are to find a man named Jurgen in the south of Albion. My research indicates that he might know what this book is, and therefore who might have stolen it." Varden cocked his head. "Jurgen? Who is he?" "He was once a scholar in his own right, who lived at Arfel before the war. He might have come across this book before when he lived with the Dragon Riders." "Jurgen works with the Sirens." Durnus made a face. "He is Siren. He studied in Hosfen before the war broke out. A historian, like me. Led all sorts of expeditions. But 10 years ago, he was attacked by a lichen somewhere in the ice fields. He fled to Albion, hiding in the mountains to the north, where he lived for many years, fighting the wolf curse. However, I've had word that a year ago he took up residence in the Dornoch Hills to the south, and is now living alone somewhere on the moors. It would seem the locals have lost many a sheep, he said before pausing to shudder. The very thought of a lichen makes me sick. Varden smiled, distracted. A lichen in Albion was very peculiar. They stuck to the far eastern wilds on the steppes and pine forests of eastern Skolgard. When do I leave? He asked, reaching up to stretch his back. His wound sang out, and he winced. Pardon? Varden could feel the numbing fingers of tiredness creeping over him. The fatigue spell he cast the day before to keep him moving was finally starting to wear off. Durnus wagged a finger at him. Tonight, Varden, you rest and no arguments. You have plenty of time for slumber. It's not as though the Arca will fall apart overnight. As long as nothing happens to their gold, I think we're safe, said Varden, and the vampire laughed. Politics, Varden. Politics, rules, and using them against others. That's what they care about. People like us belong out here on the fringes, where it matters. Somehow I can't see us cooped up in a hall debating the finer points of civilization, he chuckled. The mage nodded. He wandered around the room, flicking through interesting-looking parchments and book covers. So you don't miss it then? He asked. Durnus threw him a quizzical look. The city? Being in the thick of it. Durnus shook his head. No. I thought one of the reasons you came here, Varden, like I did, was to get away from all the pressure of the gossip and the politics. I was never at home in the Arcathedral. Varden picked up another book, fighting a yawn. What's wrong? Asked Durnus. Varden shook his head and managed a weary smile. I'm fine, don't worry. The vampire nodded, showing a sliver of fang between his chalk lips. Fancy some wine? He said, pointing to a table in the corner of the room. An ornate green bottle filled with a dark liquid sat upon it, with 2 glasses for company. Varden picked up the bottle and wiggled the wooden stopper free, then gave the liquid a careful sniff. As long as it's not the blood of some poor local, then yes, I would, he replied, narrowing his eyes at his friend. Durnus laughed, gesturing to the chair. Varden sat. Despite his tiredness, the mage remained holed up in Durnus' room for the rest of the evening, their tongues wagging over war, peace, murder, and magic, washing their words down with plenty of wine. When the night stretched into early morning, Varden finally left the vampire's room. His head was spinning with tiredness, alcohol, and snatches of regurgitated conversation. He could feel himself starting down a trail of thought that he disliked very much. The mage wandered through the dark corridors of the Arch-Abbey and tried to calm himself. As Varden lay down on his cold bed, thoughts began to dance around his head like insects around a candle, second-guessing and doubts rife in his shallow dozing. Smothered by the darkness of his room, he tossed and turned until finally he banged his fist on the pillow in frustration. Varden got up and stumbled across the stone floor until his foot kicked at his traveling bag full of supplies. He rummaged around for a while before finding what he was looking for. He had hidden it deep. Varden moved to the door and locked it. He started unwrapping a small, scrunched-up bit of bark cloth. He stopped for a moment to listen to the noises of the night, then quietly put a small pinch of something on his tongue. Varden went to the windowsill and looked out at the dark forest, listening to a lonely owl hoot. He closed his eyes and chewed, waiting. After a while, the mage felt the numbness gradually climb from his mouth into his spine, and the stuff began to sour in his mouth. Varden spat and heard the thoughts quieten, felt himself slowly forgetting. Before he got lost in the dizziness, he grabbed a nearby candlestick and wedged the bundle of bark cloth into its hollow base. With a thud, he put the candlestick back on the bedside table and let his world begin to melt. His head felt like water spilling over a never-ending wheel. Varden gradually let sleep take him hostage, allowing it to cut away his problems one by one, forgotten for now. The mage was in a desert. Varden lifted his hands to feel the hot rays of the strange red sun dance across his skin. He wore only his trousers and the red gold vambraces. His feet were bare. The cracked, dusty earth quivered and shook in the sweltering heat. Pebbles floated from side to side across the sand, hitting in the spaces between his blinks. In the haze of the distance, the horizon was darkened by huge black mountains scraping at the heavens. Varden looked up and around him in all directions. He had never seen a sky so big, so massive, or so empty. He felt something scratching at his leg and looked down to find a skinny black cat impatiently clawing at him. The thing mewed at him, yawning cavernously, a yawn too big for a cat that small. Varden watched the thing scratch about. It fixed him with an obsidian gaze, eyes like two black scry mirrors, and cocked its head on one side. "What?" Varden asked, not sure if he really expected an answer. This was a dream, wasn't it? He became aware of his skin starting to tingle and shiver. Bolts of pain began to shoot up his arms as if he slept on them for too long and now sought to move them. Varden looked down to see flakes of burning skin peel from his hands and wrists. His arms and chest started to brown and blacken. The veins and arteries under the skin melted into rivers of fire. His vambraces cracked and splintered into pieces before his eyes, then fell to the dust with a dull clang that reverberated and roared, becoming an unbearable cacophony in his ears, like the mountains were dragging themselves across the desert toward him, inch by inch, but closing in. Varden lifted his hands to his face and felt the charred bone underneath, watching shreds of flaming skin fill the air like a swarm of locusts in the hot wind. Varden opened his mouth to scream, but his tongue was too dry, refusing to move, sitting smoldering between his black teeth. Before his eyes were burnt to dust, Varden looked down at the cat. It stared at him with a placid, bored look, then its tiny mouth seemed to curl into a smile. The mage heard a voice in his head speak clearly over the fire and the roaring wind. "Follow the dragons," it said. Then the wind swallowed him. Sunlight streamed in through the open window, piercing the sleeping mage's eyelids like a yellow spear and sending pain jolting through his skull. Varden swore darkly and hoisted himself out of bed. Remnants of a dream swirled around him, but they quickly dissolved to nothing in the morning light. The early sun has a habit of stealing the memories of dreams from the mind, as if they are too dangerous to hold on to. There came a knock at his door, and Alessi shuffled into the cold room, holding a small wooden cup of something and a bowl of homemade porridge. "Good morning," she said with a bright smile, her face the opposite of Varden's mood. "Is it?" Varden coughed and tried to look awake, fighting off the haze of the night before. He grabbed a nearby shirt and threw it on to cover the wound on his back. Alessi put the breakfast on a table in the corner of the room and began to sort out clothes for his journey. Varden stalked over to the table and sniffed the juice. Apple. He downed it in one gulp and grabbed a spoonful of porridge. He managed one mouthful before feeling ill. "How'd you sleep?" asked Alessi as she set to cleaning some of his armor. His battered sword was on the bed. The tired mage swept the blade from his scabbard and looked at the notched edge, scarred from many a battle. Many a worm claw, too. "I need a new sword," he said absently before turning his attention to the maid bustling around his room. "I slept well, thank you for asking. Jonas and I talked long into the night. Is he up yet, or should I go wake him?" "Rumor has it he went out hunting last night, but he should be back in his room by now. It makes my skin crawl when I think of what he's been up to." Alessi shivered involuntarily. "He can't help his nature, and it does wonders for keeping the townspeople out of the forest." Varden smiled wanly at his own joke. His head pounded like a drum. "There, your armor is all clean, and there's a fresh cloak and tunic here for you. Fresh supplies are in your haversack as usual. I know how you don't like certain kitchens for food, what with the other maids there," she said and made to leave. She lingered at the door for a moment. "Thank you, Alessi," said Varden as he tried another spoon of breakfast. She looked as if she were about to say something but thought better of it and closed the door. Varden milled around in his room for a bit, struggling to shake the numbness he still felt from the drug, the Nevermore, and the strange remnants of a vivid dream he could have sworn was real. The mage rubbed his cold skin and shook his head from side to side to see if it would rattle some sense into him. He could feel the hangover dimming his magic, like alcohol diminishes the ability to walk in a straight line. Varden took a warm cloth from a bowl of warm water and dabbed the wound at his side. It was healing up nicely, but was still angry, red, and sore. It would be healed by the next day. His fingers traced something on his back for just a moment before he turned to face a bronze mirror in the corner of his modest room and stare at his reflection. Varden looked exhausted. His dark, almost black hair was in a wilder state than usual, and from behind the tangled strands that lay across his face he could see dark rings surrounding his gray-green eyes. The mage ran an exploratory hand across his face, examining the rest of him, rubbing stubble and dust between his fingertips, blinking at his bronze alter ego to try to make it more acceptable. Varden was a tall man, just over 6 foot and well built, perhaps a few years over 30. Nobody but Varden was sure. His arms and body bore countless scars from blade and magic, random streaks of pinky white crisscrossing his already pale skin, like the paths of a snail. There was a small tattoo on each of his wrists, a black outline of a skeleton key, edged in tiny lines of script. He rubbed at them briefly before sliding his red and gold vambraces over them. Next came a brown tunic made of rough cloth, and over that went his thick and simple steel-plate armor. It hooked his body closely, but still allowed him to move if needed, unlike the thicker, more elaborate suits of armor from Skullguard or Nelska. Varden strapped on a thick rust-colored belt, some more plate armor for his thighs, then stuffed his feet into a pair of heavy black ranger boots. Lastly, he donned a long black cloak with a hood and strapped his sword into its scabbard on his back, arranging a red scarf to wrap around his neck. Despite the pounding headache and dizzy stomach, Varden smiled a rare smile at his bronze reflection. He was ready to go once again. Varden slammed the door to his room and bounded downstairs, barging past a few kitchen boys carrying pitchers of milk. They stood dumbstruck as the dark character swept past them and down the hallway, muttering only the briefest of apologies. The mage went straight to the main hall of the Arcabbey, where a small shrine sat against the north wall. His footsteps echoed loudly on the stone. Varden knelt before the shrine, where a statue of a powerful-looking woman sat. She held out a pair of marble scales, as if demanding something. Her stern stone gaze looked out over the myriad of candles that had been lit on her plinth. This was Avernia, goddess of magic to the Arca, and keeper of balance. After he whispered a standard prayer to the goddess, Varden tossed a small coin onto a stone dish. The old gods didn't hold as much sway over the lands of Emaneska as they did in the ancient days, but it was still wise to stay on good terms with the fickle creatures. Durnus dropped to one knee next to Varden and whispered something to the stone statue. There was a moment of silence as he finished his prayer. "I don't often see you paying homage to the old ones," he commented in a hoarse voice. Varden shrugged. "It seems like a good idea to keep on their good sides," he said. The vampire nodded. "That it does. How did you sleep?" he asked. Durnus himself looked tired. His eyes were even paler than usual, and the large hooded cloak he wore did nothing to conceal the fatigue hiding in bags under his skin. "Everyone always asks me that, as if I were a stranger to a bed." Varden smiled wryly. "Well, thank you. I hear you had a good night." "Gods damn those maids. They have tongues like town criers. I would cast a mute spell on every last one of them if I had the chance to do so. I take it Alessi told you." Durnus cursed, bowing his head to the statue as he stood up. He turned to leave, and Varden followed him towards a thin door. The thick cloth curtains on the archway shifted in a chill draught. "That one does like to talk," grinned Varden, as they walked down a dark corridor. The Arcabbey was still in the process of waking up. The servants were preparing breakfast for the slumbering soldiers, and a few scribes wandered the halls, rubbing sleepy eyes and yawning. "So I have noticed. You haven't said anything to her about what happened in Arfel, have you?" Durnus' pale eyes grew narrow, and he furrowed his brow at his friend. Varden shook his head. "No, I went straight to bed after I left your room last night. I barely talked to her at all this morning when she woke me with breakfast. I know the rules, and with a dangerous matter like this, I wouldn't exactly go shouting about it." "Good," said Durnus. The vampire seemed satisfied and sniffed imperiously. He ducked under a random shaft of sunlight coming from a high window and folded his gloved hands behind his back. The two walked slowly and silently for a moment before Durnus spoke up again. "You look tired, Farden. Anything the matter?" "The headache of an anvil and stomach-grueling dizziness," thought the mage. "Absolutely nothing. Deep sleep, and I'm still waking up," lied Farden. "Far too easy." Durnus waved a hand. "Now remember, get as much information out of Jurgen as you can. I'm not sure how he's fared since his exile, and the wolf curse does strange things to a man, so be wary of his answers. After all, he may have a mind like that of soft cheese and be completely useless, but above all, make sure that you get the truth. If the archmages are going to base their actions on your words, then they had better be the right ones," the vampire lectured. Varden's head ached. His old friend pulled a roll of parchment from the folds in his cloak. "Jurgen was last seen somewhere near Ben, south of the Dornach Hills. You can rest up in the town and then face him the day after. Unfortunately for you, the pull of the moon is strong this month, so he'll be able to change at will." Varden nodded. "Trust me, I can handle him." Durnus flashed him a toothy smile. "It's not you I'm worried about, my dear mage. He's the only lead we've got putting an end to this book debacle. What I mean to say is don't kill him, Farden," he ordered with a chuckle, but both of them knew there was a serious undertone to the command. "I won't." Farden paused in an arched doorway. Durnus stayed in the shadows of the corridor and away from the morning light. Farden held out a hand, and the vampire gripped it in an iron handshake. Durnus smiled. "Don't wait up for me." Farden pulled his red scarf around his neck and chin. "I never do," Durnus replied. Farden turned around and jogged over the wet lawn into the thick forest. The mage disappeared behind the trees, and Durnus returned to his room, saying more than a few charms for good luck. Sorry, I'm going to do a little sippy. Chapter 3. A dragon's claws are curved and deadly, much like the strange daggers from the east. Beware the teeth, too. A large dragon can have up to 3 rows of teeth and gnash them in a fearsome manner before eating. A dragon may have a long or short tail, but either invariably have a forked or barbed tip that swishes around angrily should a traveler choose to approach. Their scales have the power to mystify, with rippling colors that can hypnotize the unwary, and some may even change color to match their backgrounds. From Dragons and Their Features, Lessons in Identifying the Siren Beast by Master Word. It was raining hard when Farden walked through the industrious streets of Ben. Townsfolk and strangers trotted through the muddy streets, and carts pulled by cows and donkeys splashed through puddles, soaking the passers-by and dirtying the colors of the market stalls lining the road. People crowded in the shadows of the tall houses. The wooden buildings leant out over the thoroughfares as though they would topple at any moment, heavy with tall, arched slate roofs, brick chimneys, and gurgling gutters. Farden shrugged rainwater from his cloak for the 100th time and drove his hands deeper into the pockets, hoping to find a dry spot somewhere. His gray eyes roved over the various wares that were on offer in the little tents, their tables adorned with food, clothing, weapons, and cheap trinkets. The shopkeepers brayed tenaciously through the downpour with offers of bargains and special prices. A wet, miserable customer is still a customer. Ahead, a building jutted into the road. A striped tent had been hoisted up to cover some benches and a wall, where gloomy figures hunched over pots of ale, plates of bread, and farska, a cheap beef stew sold in taverns all over dreary Albion and Emaneska. Farden trudged through the muddy puddles and cart ruts, dodging the brown rivers of rubbish. After 3 long days of urgent travel, he was starting to run out of food. As he neared the tent, the mage spied a small blacksmith shop nestled in the back of the building. A table of shining weapons glinted in the bright firelight from the forge, and a thin, soot-smeared man stood holding a file to an axe. Patrons milled around the tables, holding various blades and sharp objects. Stocky, grim men, the sort that oozed dark aspirations and malicious intent. A group of them hunched over the end of the table, clad in long, dark cloaks and smoking cheap tobacco from even cheaper pipes. Varden made his way to the front of a table and ran his hands over the shining swords and knives. His eyes picked out a long sword, sheathed in a thick black leather scabbard, with thick crossbars and a long, steel, leather-bound handle with the pommel stone shaped like a huge black diamond. Varden unsheathed the weapon and ran a careful thumb over the blade's sharp edges. It was a fine sword, that's for sure. "See something you like, boy?" a bald skeleton of a man croaked in a thick Albion drawl. The dirty blacksmith tugged at the gray-white gloves covering his bony hands. They were made from salamander wool, impervious to fire and perfect for working a forge. "How much for this, old man?" Varden asked, waving the sword at him. The smith looked at the blade and chewed something in the back of his mouth. 100 silver." 100? You've got to be joking. I'll give you 60. Fair price for this blade. Varden shook his head and crossed his arms. The nearby men had gone silent, intrigued by the sale and the foreign-looking mage. 80 or no sale. The old man struck out a greasy palm. The mage unbuckled his notched sword from his back and tossed it to the blacksmith with a grunt. 60, and you can have that, old man. It's still got a few swings in it. Varden strapped the new longsword in its place and fastened the thick buckle around his armored chest. The old smith cleared his throat grumpily, shrugged, and finally nodded. Varden took a coin purse from the travel pack at his side and gave the man 60 silver pieces. Varden noticed the silence at the table and turned to meet the stare of a bald thug on his left, a man with a scar across his forehead. He managed to hold the mage's piercing gaze for a moment before turning away to grin at his companions. With a nod, he walked away, and his minions followed him like loyal dogs in their master's wake. Varden finished counting out the silver pieces, and the smith began to spirit them away, sliding each coin into his pocket with a relish. Their business concluded, Varden turned to go, but something polished and bright on the next table caught his attention. Something shining with reflection of the hot forge. It was a little hand mirror. It lay propped up against a wooden post at the far edge of the stall, surrounded by cheap cutlery and barely polished ornaments. "Smith, is that mirror silver?" asked Varden. The smith turned and looked at the glimmering object, rubbing his filthy chin with equally filthy fingers. "Yeah, 'tis. Made it last week for the posh ladies of the town, you see. Give 'em something to look at their pretty faces with." He leered, exposing empty gums where teeth should have been. He paused to spit into a clay pot near the crackling forge. "You want that too?" "This is important, old man." Varden leveled a finger at the blacksmith. The mage knew his magic lore, and of the rules that bound each creature. If Jurgen was a lichen, then he would fear silver. The rumors about using silver blades or arrows to kill creatures were absolute rubbish. Any blade would do as long as it was sharp enough and thrust into the right place. However, if a lichen saw the reflection in something silver, like a silver mirror, for example, then the curse would break momentarily, and they would return to their naked, shivering human forms, dizzy and exhausted after the sudden transformation. He would give him an hour with the man, without the wolf to bother him, maybe 2 if he was lucky, and if the moon stayed out of sight. Varden had faced the lichen only once before on the ice fields in the far north. He had been let off easily that time. The skinny creature had merely stalked him for a day or 2 at the most, only once getting close enough for a spell, but otherwise keeping its distance. Varden remembered the fear as if it were yesterday. Lichens were incredibly dangerous. Their vicious claws and teeth were matched only by their strength and lightning speed. And of course, it only took a single bite or scratch to curse a man. "This mirror has to be pure silver. You understand? If I find out it's a fake, there's going to be trouble between you and I, and more than just the mirror will be returned to you." Varden tapped his new sword's hilt menacingly with one hand, and with the other, he summoned a little flame to burn on his palm. The old smith took a step back and held up anxious, shaking hands. "Easy, easy. Ain't no reason to get violent here. It's silver, have no fear, mage." The smith flashed an uneasy smile. "How about a special price of 25 silver? Between you and me," he offered. Varden didn't trust him at all, but he needed something shiny and silver. He had forgotten to find one before he left. The mage nodded, and the smith rushed to fetch the mirror from amongst the other trinkets at the back of the oak table. Varden looked about him once again. The Nevermore was still numbing his magic ability, and now a fresh throbbing had taken up residence in his head. Assured that nobody had seen his little demonstration, Varden counted out the overpriced sum of 25 silver coins to the fidgety little smith. He put the mirror in his travel bag and let the man scurry back to the safety of a smoldering forge. Varden stepped back into the pouring rain and went to look for a few food supplies for the last part of his journey. After purchasing some dried meat, tough biscuits, and apples, he headed down the hill towards the south gate of the muddy town. He found his pace getting a little quicker with every step closer he got to Jurgen. It was nothing but his nature. A short while later, Varden found himself striding along a quiet road near the south wall of Ben. Night was slowly approaching, and lamps of the town were busy being lit. 100 twinkling lights hiding behind curtains, sitting on tables and in iron sconces. It almost made the town look pretty, but only in a futile way. It was like painting a corpse gold. It still rotted underneath. The persistent rain fell hard, and the downpour was now driven by the approaching wind. In the distance, white lightning ripped through the cloudy darkness. The flashes tore at the night, etching the hills and bringing rumbling cracks and deep, faraway booms to the mage's ears. Varden watched his own boots slosh through the mud, as if his eyes kept them moving, not his muscles. It was foul weather, even by Albion standards, but his cloak was warm and kept him protected from the elements. This new sword was a touch heavier, but it felt good to have a decent blade for a change, he thought. Through his musings, he heard a muffled cough from behind him. He turned to see a burly figure following in his wake, about 20 yards behind him. Turning back, Varden cast sideways glances at the silent, dripping houses and tiny alleyways. Another man, skinny and bedraggled, was leaning against a wall smoking a pipe. In the rain ahead of him, yet another thug was coming up the road. Even though the rain hammered noisily and the puddles of mud, the sounds of splashing strides were ominously loud. Varden clicked his neck from side to side and tensed his wiry muscles, summoning the magic from the base of his skull. A wave of hangover washed over him, dimming his power and sending throbbing waves of pain ricocheting behind his eyes. Varden grunted. "We'll have to do this the old-fashioned way, then," he thought. The thug in front of him brandished a knife in his right hand, the thin blade glinting in the far-off glow of the town. It was the bald man from earlier at the forge, and in the half-light of dusk, Varden could see the rain bouncing off his shiny head and running down the scar on his brow. He grinned and waved his dagger at the smoker and the man behind Varden. They moved in, striding confidently through the mud. Varden suppressed a smirk. "Just give us your coin and we'll be on our way," warned the thug in a low voice. "You don't want any trouble here, do you, mate?" Varden spoke calmly, yet sternly, as the men surrounded him, keeping their distance. The other took out their weapons, a hammer and a club. Varden took a wider stance and stood firm. "If you and your men know what's best for you, then you'd be on your way now, without my coin, and with your limbs still attached. I don't want to have to hurt you. Don't know if you noticed, mate, but there's 3 of us, and just 1 of you, so it ain't looking too good for you, is it? Like I said, give us your fucking coin, and we won't have to leave your body for the guards to find in the alleyway, all right?" The bald man made little cutting motions in the air with his kitchen knife. He was a brute, thick-set and swarthy, with a face that had been introduced to more than its fair share of fists. A threadbare cloak hung from his wide, hunched shoulders. No mail, just a tunic. Good. Varden sighed. He should have known better than to flash his coins around in the view of men like this. He gave them another chance. "You idiots don't get it, do you? Walk away, or you won't live to see another day." Varden's eyes drilled into the hungry, frog-like glare of the bald thug. The man spat. "Get the little shit, lads! Get his coin!" he yelled. He charged wildly at the mage, feet pounding through the muddy street, dagger flailing. The 2 men collided with a massive crash. Varden turned deftly to the side and let his elbow greet the man's face. He was stopped dead in his tracks, blood mixing with the rain as his legs slid out from under him. Varden knocked the knife from his hand in one swift strike, letting him crash to the ground in a shower of mud. The mage dropped to his knees and drew his sword with the metallic ring, waiting for his prey to come to him. The next thug was already running at him, barely 3 yards away. Varden swung the long sword in a wide arc, catching the thief square in the ribs. There was a sickening crunch as it smashed through bone and flesh to bite into spine. The man let out an unearthly scream and crumbled to a bloody heap next to his bald comrade, writhing and spilling vital organs into the incarnadine mud. Sorry, that was a new word for me. The last thug ran in with a shout, waving a long club high above his head. "I'll kill her!" he was yelling. He really should have known better. Pushing through the pain, Varden smacked his wrists together with the clang. Fire unfurled into the night, exploding from his hands. The bolt burst against the man's chest with a flash of flame that seared the clothes from his skin. He hit the mud flat on his back with a hiss, choking on pain and rainwater. Varden dashed towards him as he struggled to lift his head up from the cloying mud. Without missing a stride, he sent his boot flying into the grimy thug's nose. The man's face exploded in a spatter of blood and bone as his head slammed back into the muck with a nauseating thwack. He did not move again. Varden skidded to a halt and crouched, listening to nothing but the dripping rain. The bald man stirred under the grotesque carcass of his friend. His face looked like a crimson landslide. He lifted shaking fingers to feel the damage, breathing through cracked teeth. Watching the thug struggle, Varden retrieved his grimy sword and wiped it on the leg of the charred man. Durnus would not have been happy with such a vicious display, he thought, but Durnus wasn't here. "Told you to walk away." The man had only malformed curses for him. "Huck you!" Varden shrugged and turned his back, walking away into the night. He let the rain drip down his face, cooling his hot, angry skin. Varden let the fight replay in his head, a guilty smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "Might as well start the night as I mean to go on." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the soaking piece of parchment. He looked at the lines and contours of the map, at the word Jurgen, then shoved it back into his pocket. Varden began to jog. Six hours later, a lone figure crouched on the summit of a low hill, his long cloak billowing in the stormy wind, rain lashing his unblinking features. The man was staring avidly at a small hovel that cowered in a shallow valley between two hills. Gods only knew how it was surviving the weather. Its rough wood and stacked stone walls were shaking violently in the howling gale and vicious rain. A single struggling candle peeked from a tiny window. The man's eyes flicked up the cloudy sky as a fleeting gap in the clouds revealed the white saucer of a full moon, radiating blue light down on the hills for just a moment. His gaze returned to the hovel. Varden had been watching this poor excuse for a house since discovering it 3 hours earlier. His headache had finally gone, thank the gods, and now he could feel the power swelling in his wrists and his head. The magic ran through his veins like a strong river surging through a canyon. A faint glow came from under his cloak, but he tried to keep it under control. Creatures like Jurgen could sense magic, smell it, like the worm had at Carnbreg. They hunted it, given the chance. The wind slammed into him with hurricane force and rain pelted his face, yet Varden didn't blink, so focused was he on his task. Something moved in the corner of his eye. The mage snapped his head in its direction and slowly rose to stand. He inched his sword from its sheath and gripped it with both hands. An unusual nervousness crept over him, and his breathing quickened. For what felt like an age, Varden waited, frozen, watching the stormy hillside getting lashed with curtains of rain. Nothing. He slowly crouched down again and looked back at the hovel. The candle had gone out. A massive shape barreled out of the rain and into the mage, driving the air from his lungs and sending him flying down the hill. The hairy creature fell with him, snarling savagely as its jaws snapped in his ear. Varden felt a sword fall from his hand and dig into the grass as he clawed at the ground. The beast slid off of him as he latched onto a boulder, grinding to a halt. He scabbled upright and thumped the ground hard with his fist. A searing light cut through the darkness of the stormy night, revealing a hulking creature standing a dozen yards down the hillside. Matted hair drenched with rain, hot breath escaping in great plumes from a mouthful of fangs. It growled and snarled, words slipping through the yellow daggers it called teeth. "Leave this place," the lichen barked. Its long arms hung low, dangling beside thick, muscular legs. Its curving claws were dripping with water. "I've come to find Jurgen. I must speak with him," Varden shouted above the gale. He slowly moved back towards the sword, and the lichen took a menacing step forwards in return. The thing's eyes were red pools of pure madness. Varden slid a hand into his pack and searched for something shiny. "Jurgen is dead. He doesn't live here and never has, so leave." The lichen crouched low. His thick wolf's mane stood upright, flapping in the wind. Varden took another step back, and a sword hilt knocked against his leg. The mage held out a hand, warding the animal off, trying to get through to the man inside. "I don't want to hurt you, Jurgen. I just want to talk." Varden's heart was beating double time against his breastplate. "Rargh!" The lichen snarled and leapt towards his prey. Varden smacked his wrists together again and stamped his foot. A wall of fire burst out of the ground and ripped through the rain, but the agile creature jumped over the flames. He bared his teeth in the red glow. Varden whirled his sword and dodged as Jurgen flew past him. The lichen skidded on the wet grass, and with a terrible clicking he unhinged his jaw even wider. The mage summoned a huge globe of fire and aimed it at the growling animal. The fireball smacked into the lichen's shoulder blade, sending him sprawling. Varden bravely strode forwards and held his long sword high. Jurgen roared deafeningly. He sprinted towards the mage, swinging his claws in mad arcs. Varden blocked and cut straight across Jurgen's left arm. It sent the lichen reeling backwards, yelping, but he managed to reach out with one wild punch. The knock caught Varden on the breastplate, winding him and cracking a rib. The mage might have stumbled, but did not falter and jabbed back at Jurgen, finding the skin at his neck beneath the matted hair. With a yell, Varden yanked the mirror from his bag and showed it to the cowering lichen, lifting his light spell to blinding levels. "Look at this!" the mage yelled. Jurgen blinked and squinted at the silver trinket, covering his eyes with bleeding hands. "Look!" Varden marched forwards, mirror outstretched before him. The beast barked a guttural laugh and shouted above the rain, "You should tell your maid to buy you better mirrors, mage!" Jurgen kicked out at Varden with his long hind leg, catching him right below his throat. Varden tumbled backwards with a cry, but as he fell, he flung a small bolt of fire at Jurgen. The lichen leapt back, swiping fire from his face. Varden regained his stance, the wind blowing the smell of charred hair and flesh to his keen nose. Gritting his teeth, Varden threw a massive bolt of fire at the creature and followed it up with a quick spell to drain the lichen's strength. Jurgen barked as he threw a rock. The mage sidestepped the missile and continued to throw spell after spell into the night. A blast of lightning threw the lichen to the ground. Varden seized his chance, throwing his arms out wide and grunting. A ripple of magic spread through the ground, like a carpet being shaken. Rocks flew in all directions. The quake spell hit the lichen in the back, and the crack of several bones was audible. Varden reeled from the effort, cramps striking his arms like a hammer bouncing off an anvil. Varden staggered forwards, watching the beast scrabble upright. Jurgen's fur and skin were raw in patches, and blood gushed from his arm wound. "Leave!" the lichen hissed. Varden held his arms wide, twin balls of fire spinning in each hand. "Let me talk to Jurgen! I know he's in there somewhere!" he roared. He felt the drain tugging at his legs, making them shake, pulling his eyes upwards into his skull. He was struggling to maintain this level of spellcasting, but it was the only way he could make the lichen retreat. "No!" Jurgen pounced, and Varden clapped his hands together with a blast of flame. But the lichen was too quick. The spell broke, sending the two of them flailing to the ground. Varden struggled for his life as razor teeth snapped an inch from his face. Claws dug deep furrows in the grass next to his head. Varden used all his strength to hold back the beast with a sword, shoring up his efforts with an iron spell of force. "Get off!" Varden shouted, rolling to the side. His blade sliced across Jurgen's chest and raked down his ribs. The lichen leapt back, but not before scraping a claw across Farden's breastplate. Farden could not chance even the smallest of scratches. He whirled his sword around like a madman in an effort attempt to keep the beast back. Relentless magic was the only weapon fit for Jurgen. If he had to fight until the sun came up, then so be it. Lightning forked the sky above them, and a roar of thunder followed it. Jurgen howled a haunting cry, arching his head towards the heavy clouds. The two of them circled again, both breathing hard and shaking with effort. The creature was bleeding from multiple places, but the wounds already seemed to be healing and scabbing over. Farden cursed. The mage ran the flat of his sword over his left gauntlet, and the blade burst into flame, spitting and crackling. He threw 2 more spears of fire at the lichen. Jurgen ducked and rolled, the flames licking his flanks. Lightning washed over him as Farden hit him with another spell. Jurgen was getting tired. The wolf curse was starting to break under the pressure of such relentless magic. Farden was starting to crack as well, but he was far from giving up. He slammed his sword into the ground and began to concentrate on the wind around him, forcing a vortex of rain to spin around the snarling lichen. The wind howled like a banshee, battering Jurgen mercilessly. Farden kept straining, driving the vortex faster. The wind tore back his hood and rain lashed his face, but his jaw was set, his face drained of color. Jurgen fell to his knees. "Leave me alone!" he shrieked, scrambling to be free. He turned tail and scampered away into the night, howling as he disappeared. As the wind died down, Farden swayed on his feet. He lowered his hands and collapsed into the soaking grass with exhaustion, still trying to keep his eyes open and fixed on the hills around him. It was useless. The night swallowed him. Morning brought him iron skies and a light, drizzling rain. The rolling green hills lay quiet and sodden, the outcrops of rock black with dirt and flame from the night before. Farden lay in a trance, hunched up with his knees at his chin, cloak gathered around him in a tight bundle. He had forced down some meat and water at some point in the morning in an attempt to stay awake. Exhausted, he wiped rain from his face from the 1,000th time. In the scales of his vambraces he saw his reflection. His eyes were surrounded by dark rings and his lips were white with the cold. Black sodden hair covered his face, and stubble was starting to decorate his chin. A mess, he thought. In the valley below him lay the wooden and stone hovel, which Jurgen had retreated to earlier that morning. After the battle, the lichen had disappeared into the storm, howling occasionally and spying on Farden from a nearby hill. When dawn finally broke over the moors, Jurgen had begun to transform. He had slunk back into his hovel and locked the door. Sorry. I'm trying to move the mic when I do that so it's not super loud. With a sigh, Farden forced himself to his feet and drew his sword. He gripped the cold steel and bound leather with his weary, frozen fingers and cleared his dry throat with a crumbly, hoarse cough. After taking a final swig of rainwater from his flask and relieving himself gratefully behind the boulder, the mage strode determinedly down the sloping hill. "Jurgen! Come out here and talk! Don't make me cut your head off, you cur!" Farden barked. He marched up the poor excuse of a door and banged loudly on the rough wooden planks. No answer. "Jurgen! Get up!" Farden kicked the door in and cast a light spell to burn the darkness out of the hovel's interior. It was a stinking mess. The rancid smell of wet dog and rotten meat caused the mage to gag. A clatter of pans came from the corner behind the door, and Farden stormed inwards, sword raised. Don't kill me!" pleaded Jurgen. He held up his muddy hands in defense and covered his eyes with his arms. Pale, skinny legs flailed in the air as the gaunt man flailed in the dirt. The mage's magic burnt his eyes, and he spluttered and coughed. "Please, I'll do whatever you want," he managed, and Farden let his spell die. He looked down at him, wrinkling his lip. The years and his curse had not treated him well. They had eaten at his soul as well as his muscle. It was obvious in his faintly purple eyes. Wild as they were, at their core, something had died. replaced with a coldness that made Farden shiver if he looked too long. It can eat away at a man, knowing that he is truly a monster underneath, and that there's nothing to be done about it. It turns him into a shadow of himself. Jurgen's arms were stick-thin, more bone than skin. His brown fingernails were long and wiry, and starting to curl with age. A scrap of cloth was all he wore, half a tunic, soiled with mud and blood, with holes where his ribs poked out through papery skin. His straggly white hair hung over a weary face, eyes poking from deep holes above sharp cheekbones and cracked lips. Scales adorned his chin amidst gray stubble. Little flecks of blue striped his cheeks and ears, memories of a life spent elsewhere as something else. This wretched creature was the complete opposite of the foul beast he had faced in the night. Jurgen was now the antithesis of threatening, just a broken old man lying in the muck, and the mage felt a tinge of pity for him. Scaly feet and ankles kicked pans as the exhausted siren lichen hauled himself to a sitting position. Farden leant against the doorpost and waggled the fierce tip of a sword at the cowering man. "You'd better have whatever I came for, or you'll wish I had killed you last night," he spat. Jurgen was still breathing heavily, his bony chest heaving up and down with his panting. "I thought you were here for sport, like the others." "What others?" Farden snapped. Jurgen flinched. "The others that come here to hunt me. Every year or so, somebody tries. How was I supposed to know who you were and what you wanted? I haven't spoken to anyone in months or years." He looked down into the mud, cocking his head on one side like a dog. "What do you want from me, Arca?" Farden sheathed the sword. "Information that you have, old man, or had." Jurgen shook his head as if his fate had already been decided for him. "And what could I possibly know that's of any value to you?" Farden scowled. "Well, let's find out, shall we? 3 days ago, something was stolen from my people. And you think I had something to do with it?" Jurgen interrupted, his voice suddenly coarser. He glared up at Farden, baring the edges of his teeth, and the mage saw a little of the wolf come closer to the surface. Farden felt his own anger boiling in his chest. This cursed old skeleton was being petulant. Farden crouched down, bringing his face closer to Jurgen's. "Listen here, old man, and listen well. After last night, you're lucky I didn't just set fire to your hut and be done with you. But I've been sent here for information, and I don't intend on leaving without it. I suggest that you give me what I want. And if you interrupt me again, it will be the last thing you do. Tell me what I want to know, and I'll leave you in peace, or end your miserable existence, if that is your wish." The mage's eyes burnt with fire. Jurgen nodded, simmered down, and they both rose warily. The old siren found a seat by the small stove, and Farden remaining standing, arms crossed and stern. Jurgen took a few deep breaths, licked his dry, cracked lips, and gestured with the wave of his papery hand. "Please, go on." Farden flashed a humorless smile. The stolen item was a book that was taken from the sirens during the war. It was a book of great magic, small, with a black dragon scale cover. My masters think you studied this book years ago when you lived in Nelska. The lichen looked away. "That was a long time ago, mage." "Well, I need you to remember." Jurgen thought for a minute. It seemed to hurt him. His eyes were full of pain and hunger. "I have tried to forget these parts of my life, and for years I've pushed them from me, burying them in the damned beast. If I can't remember having a life, then I have nothing to miss, do I?" He paused again, narrowing his eyes. "A long time ago, years before the war, my expedition discovered a cave near the Tossenbar Mountains, and in the depths of this cave lay a hidden fort dug out of the cliffs. Inside we found a library filled with books we scholars had only dreamt of. It had been a dark elf stronghold in the old times, now long abandoned but left full of old relics and forgotten treasures. The elves had left all their belongings in a manic retreat, even leaving all their food and clothing behind in their rush. One of the treasures we found buried beneath the dust was a little black book like the one you've lost. Was it this book or not? That was such a long time ago, and my mind isn't what it used to be, but it sounds the same. A small book covered with black dragon scales, and a small gold latch on the front with a very strong spell sealing the lock. Varda nodded. That sounds like the one. Jurgen shrugged. Well, there you have it. The mage shook his head. I need more than that. What was inside the book? An irritated sigh. We took all the books we found back to the halls of Nelska to study them. It took years to accomplish. When we uncovered the Black Scale book, I happened to be one of the few sirens working on translation, trying to uncover the secrets of dark elf magic. Jurgen paused for a swig of nearby water. You sirens should know better than to mess around with elven magic, said Farden. We knew that, but at the time it seemed the best thing to do for our people. The Skullguard were expanding. You Arca encroaching further north with your ships. With power like that of the Dark Elves, we would have been unstoppable, said Jurgen, even managing to grin, if not a little wistfully. Then I'm glad we started the war before you did. Farden returned the yellow smile. Perhaps. But in any case, that book was the most fantastic example of dark elf magic we had ever seen. Once our most powerful spells had opened it, we were able to learn the summoning incantations that brought forth monsters and ghosts from the other side, calling them to fight and follow our orders. We tested some of them against several Skullguard prisoners. The results were brutal. The creatures would do anything we asked them. That is, if you were strong enough to summon one. Several of our wizards died from the strain of summoning such terrible beasts. Jurgen let his eyes haze over, remembering an age long forgotten, like a torn-out chapter of a book he had once read. Shame, Varden spat, breaking the spell. Jurgen seemed hurt, but thought better of complaining. He went on. There was one spell in the manual for summoning an ancient and terrifying monster, something even the elves feared to breed for war. None of us dared to read it. The incantation alone scared us witless. However, the old dragon called a stop to such free use of dark magic before we could learn any more, and called off our whole investigation. Farfallen had the book banished to southern Nelska, where apparently your soldiers stole it and whisked it away to Arfel. Jurgen crossed his arms. What was this spell for, then? Varden asked as he took a seat on a small wooden box. We never found out. It referred to something named Rivistokyun. Jurgen made a guttural sound of some foreign language in his throat. Varden shook his head. Something I can understand, please? Jurgen made a face as though he was teaching a child. Thy mouths of darkness, or terrible dark, something like that. All that we managed to learn was that this monster was different from the other dark creations, a crossbreed of daemon and dragon, something that old Farfallen feared greatly. That's why he put a stop to our research and had dark magic outlawed in Nelska. None of us spoke of that book again. Research is hardly the word I would use, but at least your old dragon was wise enough to end the madness, Varden admonished him. With a grunt, he reached into his travel bag for food. He tossed Jurgen a red apple and munched on another. The old man caught it awkwardly. Thank you, he whispered, before attacking the apple. Varden shrugged. He mused as he chewed, turning over Jurgen's words in his head. For a while the two sat in silence, until Jurgen piped up, mouthful of squashed apple. I take it you're one of the written, then. Varden set his jaw. It was an invasive question, but he humored him. He saw a little of Durnus in the bedraggled siren, and it was more than he could ignore. Yes, I am. Jurgen nodded slowly, a hint of something flashing in his hollow eyes. Hunger, maybe. Then I applaud you, he said. His hungry eyes roved over the mage. Carrying a book is not an easy task. I've heard the stories about the unlucky ones, those that have the magic eat away at the mind. Terrible stuff. Varden shuffled on his little box. I suggest you keep your observations to yourself, Siren. Now, why would someone want to steal this dark manual? How much would it be worth on the magic market? As I said, it's been years since I talked to anyone, Mage. As you can imagine, I usually just end up eating my guests. Jurgen's face went icy cold and his eyes glazed over again. Varden tried to find patience somewhere inside him. I saw as much last night. Come on, who would want to steal this book? Why would anybody want it? For power. But to cast the greatest spell in that book, you would have to be one of the most powerful mages in Maneska. I only know of a few, and 2 of them are the ones who sent you. The Archmages are probably the only Arca that could open the book and cast the spells within. You're probably asking the wrong person. Jurgen shrugged, but Varden didn't buy it. There are other powerful mages in the land besides the Archmages. A few of the wizards from your own lands could do it, I bet. Maybe a few Skullguard master sorcerers could give it a good try. Besides, why would my masters steal their own book? You tell me, Mage, muttered the Siren. He narrowed his eyes. I wonder, do you think you could do it? Summon the beast? Don't be ridiculous, Varden snapped, and the Lycan shrugged. If someone wanted to steal the book, then they would have to know of its existence. Excluding the Dark Elves, who are obviously not an option, that leaves the Sirens or your own people. That's the truth of it. Jurgen leant back on his rickety chair. Even with the stiff breeze sneaking through the open door, the air inside the hovel was still thick and stale. The more Varden looked at the old Siren, the more he pitied him. He obviously hadn't eaten anything for days. Jurgen had scoffed the whole apple already. He had even eaten the wooden stem. The mage shook his head and focused on his task. And if it wasn't the Arca, that means the war is far from over, concluded the mage. An ominous silence hung between them. Varden's mind ran through fields of possibilities and jumped over hedges of doubt. Could, gods forbid, one of his own Arca have committed the crime? Murdered the scholars and stolen this book? Varden's mind clouded stormily with fears, but he shook them off. There was still the matter of the Sirens, and the distinct possibility that the murderers were working completely on their own, independent of either race, Arca or Siren. Despite the dread, he felt the heat of resolve prickling his skin. Varden clenched his fists. Somebody had to put a stop to this mess before it got out of hand. Varden had to get back to Durnus. Jurgen filled the silence. If the book was stolen by someone powerful enough, strong enough to summon that terrible creature, then all of Emaneska would be in danger, not just our peoples. If you saw the things I saw, the things we brought over... Jurgen drifted off. Whatever color had returned to his old skin quickly drained away, his tone more urgent. But it's not just about being powerful or being able to cast a spell that is a challenge. But this particular beast needs a well of magic to help it cross over. The elves built deep caverns to house their magic power, reservoirs of strength for their weapons, much like the book you carry. There used to be hundreds of these wells all over the lands, but when the elves left, they were hunted down and destroyed. I'm sure you know of them. Lost by dark ones, all forgotten, he recited. Lakes of magic below paths untrodden. Yes, I've heard the dust song too, everybody has. But the last elven wells troves are gone, lost to time. So where else would someone take the book to release its power? Varden crouched, elbows on knees. Against his better judgment, he was beginning to trust the Siren's words. That's assuming you're right and that all the whales have vanished? The corner of Jurgen's mouth rose ever so slightly, as if he had won a small hand in a verbal card game. But Varden wasn't in the mood for playing games. Then tell me where I can find one. Jurgen cackled as heartily as a starved frame and rasping throat would allow. Ha! No one has uncovered one for decades. I wouldn't have the first clue where to look. Creatures of your kind are drawn to magic. You might have found one in your time with the Sirens, or maybe as a Lycan you know where one is, he said. Varden wore a dangerous look in his eye. All I know is that there are still a few left, maybe 2, maybe 3. I don't know. Jurgen held up his scarred palms in honesty. But you don't know where? We never found one. That was one of the reasons we never managed to summon the beast from the manual. Jurgen flopped his arms on his lap. Varden clenched his jaw. So if whoever has stolen this book intends to release this creature, they'll need to find one of these wells. Or they already know of one. And the only way of doing that would be through the Dragons of Nelska. Arfil's books don't stretch back far enough, but in the memories of the older dragons there may be a clue to where an elf well might lie, offered Jurgen. We never got the permission to examine their tier books. Farfallen was outraged when we asked, God's rest him. Jurgen briefly bowed his head. Then I suppose I'll be hunting dragons next instead of lichens. Varden made for the door, but Jurgen tugged at his sleeve. If you're going to Nelska, then I would ask one favor of you, the siren asked in a pleading voice, his violet eyes watching the mage adjust his belt and travel pack impatiently. What do you want? If you speak to the dragons, then at least tell them that I'm alive and not dead. That's all I ask, whined the man. Varden nodded and stepped out of the door. The breeze was sharp and cold, but the winter sun was beginning to burn away the drizzle and scatter the clouds. Varden looked back at the decrepit old man standing behind him. Thank you, Jurgen, for your help. I understand you didn't ask for this, for the life of a lichen, but I hope that you survive it a while longer, he offered. Jurgen tried to smile, as if it was the kindest thing he had heard in decades. It probably was, Varden thought. Good luck to you, Varden, if you must know. Then good luck, Varden. Gods be with you. And with that, Varden was gone, jogging across the hills back towards Ben and the Ark Abbey to the north. Jurgen shut his door and sat back down in his little chair. He looked around at the mess of his little hovel. The wind howled through the crack in the door and rattled the walls, and a single tear ran down the lichen's cheek. Night had once again fallen upon the streets of Ben. Rowdy laughter rang out from tavern doorways, and wild yells floated down from the top-floor windows of brothels. A light hammering rang through the alleyways, unnoticed or ignored. The old blacksmith was still hard at work, alone at his forge. The red glow of the fire illuminated his anvil, and sparks flew from his hammer as it beat down on a glowing spear joint. The thin old man wore a content smile. He had made a good profit on these sheep iron spears. They had earned him a fine bit of gold without too much trouble. The hammer sent another shower of sparks scattering over his salamander wool gloves. As the smith pondered his next scam, he started to whistle, tuneless and croaky. Something moved in the shadows behind him. The hammer fell again and again, like a beat to his dissonant warbling, and all the while the something drew closer behind him, creeping unnoticed, treading in the strikes of the hammer. A hand grabbed the old smith by the neck and shoved his forehead down hard, right onto the glowing spear point. The smith's skin hissed as it kissed the hot metal. "Arg!" the smith cried out, dropping to the dusty floor. He rubbed at his skin and howled. "You lied to me." The dark hooded figure spread out his fingers, and a small lightning bolt flickered over his palm, dancing in an electric blue glow. He grabbed the smith by the wrist and covered his mouth roughly. The old man squirmed as the bolt ran through his bones and rattled his spine. "Stay quiet, old man, otherwise you might make me do something I'll regret." The smith swiftly stifled his yelps and fell deadly silent, eyes wide and terrified. A few muffled questions came from behind his hand. "You lied to me about the silver mirror, and I warned you what would happen." The man jolted him again before uncovering his mouth. The smith panted, bobbing his head. I remember. I'm sorry. I'll do whatever you want. You can have your money back, I swear. Just please don't kill me," he sobbed. "You're not going to kill me, are you?" The man narrowed his eyes and watched him squirm. "Lucky for you," he snorted. "I'm not. You can keep your life and your money, old thief, but you can't have your mirror back." The fake silver trinket flew from the man's belt and collided with his jaw, cracking his jawbone and snapping teeth from their roots. The smith crumpled to the earth in a flurry of spit and blood and went silent. The mirror skipped and skittered over the dusty floor, colliding with the stone wall with a clang. Varden pulled his hood down low over his face as he marched out of the forge. Without a sound, he walked down the nearest alleyway and melted into the shadows of the ugly town. Lightning flickered on the horizon as another storm approached over the faraway hills. Thank you for being here. Thanks for the lurks and the live listens, and everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you. Good night.